On the outskirts of a nameless English parish, beyond the hedgerows and pastures where sheep grazed, there stood a house that seemed to grow out of the soil like a bruise. Its stone was darker than the cottages around it, its windows shuttered, though no wind ever shattered their glass, and its gates locked, though no thief would have dared to enter. In the late 1700s, it was already older than memory, and yet it pulsed with a strange vitality. Families spoke of it in hushed tones, never directly, as though naming the place might give it power. They knew children lived within its walls, but no one could say whose children they were. No christening bells had rung for them, no mothers were ever seen holding swaddled infants outside its gates. No birth entries were made in the parish ledger. They had appeared as if conjured, as if drawn from the shadows of the house itself, dozens of them pale and voiceless. At first the villagers told themselves it was an orphanage, some charitable experiment under the patronage of Lord Simon Alderney, the minor noble who owned the land. He was known in town only in passing, a figure who moved with a softness that unsettled those who encountered him. He smiled without warmth, shook hands without grip, and his eyes wandered to spaces above people's heads as if he saw something they could not. When asked about the children, he would speak kindly, reassuringly, of duty and of providence. He said that in a world that forgot so many, he was remembering them. The words soothed some, but they carried no weight. The evidence lay elsewhere. The baptismal fonts in the parish church remained dry. The midwives were never summoned, and still the number of children behind his gates grew. Over time, suspicion festered. Some swore they had seen wagons at night carrying small bundles, silent ones, as though the children inside had been drugged or gagged. Others spoke of faint cries drifting over the hedgerows, thin sounds that vanished when the wind shifted. No one confronted Alderney directly. His estate brought work to the surrounding farms, and his name carried favor in distant courts. To accuse him would be to expose the parish itself to ruin. And so silence became the shield. People looked the other way, muttered prayers at their hearths, and accepted that the house was not theirs to question. Inside those walls, the truth was far colder. The children were not simply unwanted, they were stripped of all belonging from the first breath. Alderney forbade names. He called names diseases of the tongue, claiming they infected a child with individuality. Each infant was recorded only as a mark in a private ledger. A circle for a girl, a cross for a boy, a star if they were sickly. He demanded silence in the halls. Children who tried to speak words of their own were punished in ways that left no mark yet seared forever. Beeswax melted over candle flames was poured across their tongues, hardening into a crust that tore at the soft flesh when pried away. The pain was sharp but temporary, and that was the point. To teach them that speech led to agony while silence led to survival. The villagers who feared to enter never saw the small graves hidden in the orchard. Each mound was unmarked, only a stone pressed flat upon the soil. Alderney insisted the bodies not be placed in the parish ground, for they did not exist in law or church. They had lived without baptism and must lie without blessing. The earth of the orchard grew thick with bones, the roots of the apple trees fattened with the remains of children whose names had never been uttered. To Alderney, this was not cruelty but purity. He believed he was cleansing the world of false lineage, creating a generation unburdened by family, free from history. To him, the orchard was not a graveyard, but a cradle of beginnings. Though each beginning ended only in the silence of the soil, what the villagers did notice was absence. Children who had played near the hedgerows sometimes wandered too close and were never seen again. The explanations came easily. Wolves in the woods, drownings in the marsh, accidents on the road. But mothers wept without reason, sensing that their children had not been taken by nature but absorbed by the house. Some whispered that Alderney offered coin to desperate fathers, that hunger drove families to trade away their weakest child. If it was true, no one confessed. Guilt hung in the parish air, but like mist it never condensed into form. The psychology of Alderney himself remained a riddle. He did not drink, did not whore, did not rage as other men of power did. He seemed gentle, precise, devoted to his house and his charges. That gentleness was his mask. In his journals he described his vision. A world where law could be rewritten in flesh, where children would grow without identity, where silence would breed obedience. He called them blanks, perfect instruments waiting to be inscribed. To him, ordinary children were polluted with memories and ties. His children would be clean pages ready to bear the weight of a new society. Every death, every grave in the orchard was simply a correction, a failure removed from the manuscript. By the end of the century, the parish had grown used to the house. It was simply part of the landscape, a shadow that did not fade no matter how bright the summer sun. People stopped asking where the children came from. They stopped wondering why the birth records remained empty. The silence of the place had worked its way into their minds, teaching them the same lesson Alderney taught his charges. That to speak was to invite pain, and to keep silent was to survive. The house stood, and within it children without names breathed and died, their lives erased before they had even begun. And so the story begins not with screams, but with quiet. A house without records, an orchard without names, a parish without courage. A silence more powerful than law. It would not last forever. The silence was only the surface of something far deeper, something waiting to unfold in methods no one dared yet imagine. Lord Simon Alderney believed identity was rot. He called it a disease of the mind, a viral inheritance passed down through names, bloodlines, and whispered affections. In his view, a child named became a child owned. By a mother's softness, a father's failure, a nation's needs. To unname was to unchain. That belief did not arrive all at once. It calcified. By the time his journals began in the spring of 1782, Alderney had already devised a full philosophy. That the soul could be shaped like parchment, blanked by force and rewritten in silence. The children he kept were not orphans. He never used that word. He called them subjects. Blank, subject 1. Blank, subject 2. By the time the ledger reached triple digits, his ink had begun to fade, but his methods only deepened. He kept no copies. He did not need to. Each child was a record in flesh. The doctrine, as he termed it, had 3 principles. The first, all names are sickness. The second, memory corrupts. The third, language is an open wound. To enforce these, Alderney began punishing deviations. The first known instance was a girl of about 6 who had taught the others to call her Elin. She had spoken the name aloud during a gathering, a whisper of self in the midst of their evening formation. Alderney recorded the infraction in his leather-bound chart with the note, "Subject attempted linguistic insurrection." That night, her punishment was carried out with ritual calm. Her tongue was coated in hot wax, dripped from a candle made of mutton fat and ash. The wax was not poured, but built, layer by layer, waiting for each coat to cool before the next. It was not only the pain he sought, but the message. Elin lived 2 more days. When she died of infection, her body was removed before morning. The other children were told nothing, but they never used another name again. Alderney's estate ran like a theological experiment. The children woke before dawn. They lined up, barefoot, silent, facing a blank wall painted bone white. They were never allowed to look into one another's eyes. Eye contact bred familiarity. Familiarity bred recognition. He believed even a glance could recreate a name in the mind. Meals were administered without utensils, bread soaked in thin broth, served from identical gray bowls. The children who tried to speak, even in gesture or hum, were taken for correction. Some were returned the next day. Others were never seen again. Each absence was followed by a quiet revision in Alderney's journal. A thin black line drawn across a page with no names, only symbols. A physician once visited, sent by a distant cousin who had grown uneasy with Alderney's reclusive tendencies. The man's arrival was polite, unannounced, but never repeated. Alderney led him through the public wing of the estate, showing clean halls, silent children, polished floors. The physician remarked on their obedience. Alderney smiled and called it the freedom of unknowing. Later that week, a new entry appeared in his ledger. Subject 121. Grown male, brief exposure processed and corrected. Spine separated from base, preserved for study. It is unclear whether the physician ever left the estate or was simply folded into the next generation of anatomical exploration. The parish made no inquiry. His name was never added to the town's list of dead. Alderney's silence infected even the record keepers. The doctrine evolved into something ceremonial. Once a month, the children were gathered in the cellar, blindfolded, and made to walk a slow circle around a shallow pit lined with salt. Alderney would read aloud from a book of blank pages. The children were told to listen for meaning. Those who nodded or moved were labeled listeners, a sign that their mind had begun to invent. Listeners were taken aside. Their ears were sealed shut with a mixture of tallow and quicklime, packed deep into the canals with rods of bone. Many went deaf permanently. Alderney believed this was purification. If language could not enter, then selfhood could not grow. The method was precise. Only one child died from the procedure in the first year. A boy who bled internally for 12 hours before collapsing mid-meal. His body was buried beneath the orchard without ceremony. Alderney wrote in his ledger, "Subject failed absorption. Return to soil." The doctrine demanded that even the concept of grief be erased. The children were trained to show no reaction to loss. If one of their number vanished, they were told to continue routines exactly as before. Emotion was punished with isolation. Those who cried were locked in the iron hoods, devices Alderney designed himself, that covered the entire head with a single breathing hole. Inside, the children could hear nothing, see nothing, taste nothing. Some stayed there for days. Most emerged quiet, hollowed, compliant, but a few collapsed, unable to speak or move. Alderney recorded these as emptied, often followed by a short notation. Useful, repeatable. And yet, beneath the cold logic of his system, something deeper stirred. Elderney did not see himself as cruel. In his private writings, he framed himself as a savior, rescuing children from the infection of names, of mothers who died screaming in childbirth, of fathers who sold their own to the millers. He believed he was creating a generation beyond pain, beyond ego. The horrors he inflicted were, to him, a vaccine against the suffering of the world. He did not weep over the deaths. He dissected them, measured pulse intervals, charted how many seconds the body spasmed after breath ceased. He called this evidence of release. The children, robbed of voice, were not without knowing. Their eyes grew dull, but their bodies remembered. Some rocked in their sleep, some scratched their arms raw. Some tried to dig beneath the floorboards with fingernails cracked to bone, but the doctrine was stronger. Over time, even resistance became ritual. They were not children anymore. They were pages clean and waiting, and Alderney wrote in them every day. The parish heard whispers, but by then the whispers had no names attached. No families stepped forward, no inquiries were made, the silence had won. What was happening within Alderney's walls was not only allowed, it was perfected, and beneath it all the doctrine grew stronger, tighter, more refined. What began as an idea had become a system, and systems once built do not fade easily. They echo, they evolve, and they consume. Alderney never believed obedience came from fear alone. Fear faded. It wore thin in the minds of children, crumbling like soot. What he sought was deeper, a reordering of instinct itself. The child must not only obey in body, but forget the impulse to resist. The child must believe that silence was not punishment, but protection. That sound was the trespass, that to scream was to cease being. His experiments in silence began in the lower wings of the estate, where natural light never reached and stone corridors remained cold even in summer. The rooms were small, sealed chambers once used for preserving root vegetables and salted meat. He renamed them resonance cradles. Within them, a child would be placed alone, barefoot, stripped of anything tactile or human, no light, no warmth, no voice but their own. Each chamber had one feature, a pipe running from the ceiling that released a constant, irregular drip of water. The sound was sharp, metallic, echoing. It struck the floor with just enough volume to become unbearable over time. Alderney had measured the acoustics. He adjusted the height of the drop and the weight of the fall so the noise would remain unpredictable, never rhythmic enough to soothe, never silent long enough to forget. The first phase of the experiment was always the same. The child was left alone in total blackness, the door sealed behind them, no way to mark the passing of time. Outside, Alderney waited with a sand glass and a quill. He recorded how long it took before the child began to whimper, then cry, then scream. The failures were consistent. Children under 5 rarely lasted more than 20 minutes. He wrote this off to insufficient cognitive formatting. Those who screamed before 60 minutes were marked with a red cross on his ledger and drowned the same day. The drowning took place in the same water that had tormented them, collected in troughs beneath the chambers. Alderney called it completing the cycle. He believed that their final breath, consumed in silence, would cleanse them of their failure. The survivors were not praised. Praise was language, and language bred identity. Instead, they were marked with a new number, their clothing replaced with a gray robe stitched with a single black thread down the spine. That thread became a symbol among the children, not of honor, but of survival at cost. Those who returned from the chambers changed. Some would not sleep unless their beds were wet. Others began muttering numbers under their breath, counting drips that no longer fell. One boy refused to eat unless he could sit in the dark, alone, beneath a leaking pipe Alderney had installed above his cot. The experiment was working. The trauma had taken root and was rewriting their understanding of comfort. Alderney's journals from this period are some of the most detailed. He writes of the moment of fracture, a precise span, usually between the 42nd and 58th minute, when a child would begin to hallucinate. Many described the sound of footsteps pacing in the dark. Some claimed a hand had touched them. One girl, nearly 7, insisted she had heard her mother's voice behind the wall. Alderney noted this as auditory intrusion caused by memory debris. She was kept in the chamber for another 3 hours. When she was removed, she could no longer blink on her own. Her muscles had seized into paralysis. She died 2 days later, unable to eat, her jaw clenched shut. Alderney wrote simply, "Closed loop. Memory expelled. Host expired." He began introducing variations. Some chambers included reflective metal plates to create echoes. Others were flooded ankle-deep, the child forced to stand motionless or risk slipping into the cold. One was rigged to emit a low, constant hum, a tone so faint it was more vibration than sound, designed to blur the line between silence and noise. He watched how each variation shifted the breaking point. Some children endured longer in water. Others fractured faster in dry rooms. Over time, Alderney developed a theory he called sound tolerance personality typing. Children were classified into categories: dampeners, absorbers, and fractures, based on how they responded. Each type had a different role in his broader system. For the fractures, those who screamed early and often, death came quickly. But even their screams were useful. He recorded their final cries with a device he built himself, using stretched calf skin and a brass horn. He called it the capture bell. The screams were preserved in sealed jars, labeled not with names but with numbers and time stamps. These jars lined the study walls, and he believed that over time the residual vibration might be studied, even reversed. He imagined a future where the scream of a broken child could be played backward to understand the exact moment the self had collapsed. Not every child was destroyed. Some adapted. One boy, never identified by name or origin, survived 17 chamber sessions. He learned to breathe shallowly, to remain perfectly still, to anticipate the drip and merge with its rhythm. Alderney wrote that this child had exhibited prelingual sanctity, a term he borrowed from early Christian martyr texts. The boy was allowed to roam the halls in silence, his mouth stitched shut with silk thread to prevent relapse. He became something of a mascot, a living proof that the doctrine could be internalized completely. But even he did not last. He threw himself into the orchard well one night, breaking every bone in his legs on the fall, then drowning silently. His body was found the next morning. Alderney marked his death not as failure but completion. He entered silence of his own will. By this time, the children no longer cried. They moved quietly, instinctively avoiding corners where shadows deepened. They did not speak. did not hum, did not even dream aloud. They began to forget the sound of language altogether. When a new child arrived, saw one of the parishes unwanted, they watched silently as the rituals began again. No one warned them. No one reached out. The house had become a laboratory of silence, each room a chamber of compliance. Alderney wrote that obedience could be taught, but true silence must be grown. It was not the absence of sound. It was the erasure of the self who might make it. And in that erasure he found his masterpiece forming, not in ink, not in flesh, but in the echo that never returned. Obedience, Alderney believed, was not a matter of will but of structure, a matter of how the body could be reshaped until the spirit followed. Silence was the first refinement, but stillness was its mirror, and nothing revealed the mechanics of stillness better than pain. In 1786, he summoned a physician to assist in formalizing what he called his anatomical obedience program. The man who arrived was Dr. Thomas Lethbridge, a quiet and unreadable presence with a background that lent him immediate authority. Lethbridge had studied briefly under John Hunter, the famed Scottish surgeon known for his radical dissections and controversial experiments on the limits of living anatomy. Though Hunter never endorsed Lethbridge formally, the young doctor carried fragments of his mentor's ideas like sacred scripture. The belief that life could be measured in seconds of breath, and obedience could be rendered visible in the stretch of a tendon or the stillness of an eye. Alderney had found in him not a servant, but a kindred mind. Lethbridge began the suspension trials within the first month of his appointment. The method was precise. A pair of sharpened iron hooks crafted to slide between the ribs without immediate fatality were inserted into the body beneath the armpits. The child, usually between 6 and 9 years of age, was stripped to the waist, hoisted slowly from the ground by a pulley mechanism, and suspended until their own weight tested the strength of their thoracic cage. The goal was not to kill, but to document. How long could the lungs inflate when the diaphragm was stretched? When would the rib cage give way? Which side would crack first? They began with 10 subjects. Lethbridge documented each in a notebook bound in pigskin, its pages numbered but unnamed. The first girl, recorded only as Subject A1, lasted 14 minutes before she lost consciousness. Her heart continued for another 3. Lethbridge noted a rapid collapse of the right posterior rib. The second subject, a boy with unusually narrow shoulders, lasted 8 minutes. His hooks tore free mid-trial, slashing his side open from within. He died shrieking, and the sound, Alderney wrote later, echoed in a way that proved how breath resists obedience. That boy was buried in the orchard, face down, spine visible through the gash. The procedure became routine. Each trial was conducted with methodical calm. No chains, no raised voices. The children were brought in quietly, made to kneel, given a cloth to bite. Most didn't scream until the weight began to pull. Alderney insisted on conducting the trials in the nursery between the cribs and the gray curtains beneath the watchful eyes of the other children. This was not only a test, it was a lesson. Stillness could be seen. Disobedience had a sound. The ones who cried out taught the others what not to become. To maintain the illusion of order, Lethbridge dressed each session in ritual. White gloves, aprons washed with vinegar, hands scrubbed in brine. The hooks were always polished to a gleam. He explained the process aloud like a teacher addressing a classroom, as if anatomy itself were being read like a poem. Heart rate, blood color, spinal curvature under stress. One day, Alderney brought in chalk and had the children sketch their own rib cages on the nursery walls. "Feel where your body ends," he told them. "Then learn how to let it go." The trials expanded into experiments. They introduced rotational motion, turning the pulley incrementally to see how torsion affected collapse. One girl, suspended with a half-turn twist, developed internal hemorrhaging in her eye sockets. Alderney called this ocular mutiny and insisted on drilling a small hole into her skull post-mortem to inspect for brain shift. Lethbridge obliged. The skull was kept on his shelf, painted white, used as a model to explain blood pressure to new arrivals. No child dared look at it for long. As the children absorbed the rituals, their bodies changed. Some began walking with shoulders hunched, instinctively guarding the ribs. Others developed breathing patterns that mimicked shallow endurance, keeping their chests still even while asleep. One boy began wrapping cloth around his own torso at night, as if trying to keep the bones from rising. Alderney saw this not as trauma, but evolution. "The body," he wrote, "learns faster than the mind. If we start there, we can reshape both." Lethbridge maintained a wall of charts, tracings of bones, sketches of damaged lungs, tissue samples stored in glass vials. Each was labeled by duration, not identity. 15 minutes severe rib flare, 10 minutes spinal buckle, 3 minutes scream onset. He never referenced names, never permitted the children to speak to him. To him, they were not patients. They were instruments. And like any well-tuned instrument, they had to be played to breaking. Rumors in the parish, though still vague, began to stir. A blacksmith's wife claimed she saw a child limp away from the estate gate, ribs visibly protruding, eyes clouded. The child was taken back before she could speak to him. A farmhand reported hearing what he thought was metal striking wood, a strange cadence like pulleys grinding under strain. But no investigations followed. The Alderney estate still paid its tithes. Its servants were quiet and paid in coin cleaner than most could earn in a year. The silence of the house was not just internal. It had infected the village. By 1790, Lethbridge's experiments had escalated. Some subjects were kept suspended not by their ribs alone, but with weights applied to their ankles, increasing the pull. This was called vertical tension study. The results were catastrophic, and internal tears, broken clavicles, lungs collapsing inward from vacuum pressure. But even those who died quickly were useful. Each death clarified a threshold. Alderney wrote, "Stillness is measured in strain. The body screams before the voice does. If we listen closely, we can hear the soul concede." What had once been a nursery was now a gallery of hushed breath and deliberate death. The walls smelled of vinegar and old blood, the floor scrubbed daily until the stone dulled. Yet the children still lined up each morning, still ate their thin broth, still lowered their eyes in unison. They had learned what Alderney had always intended. That stillness was not merely survival. It was devotion, and the ones who hung, the ones who bled in front of them, were not martyrs. They were mirrors. The hooks, when not in use, were stored in a velvet-lined box. Alderney sometimes opened it before meals, letting the children see their shine. He never needed to speak. The weight of what the box contained was enough. Lethbridge called it pre-compliance. And over time, the children began to sit straighter at the table, not from discipline, from memory, from the tension that never fully left their bones. By the winter of 1791, Alderney's obsessions turned inward. His theories had stripped children of identity, split bone from obedience, and turned breath into ritual. But there remained a source he could not yet touch, the origin. Not the child, but the vessel. Not the body, but the memory that lived before it. In the pages of his later journals, stained and warped by time, he described the female womb as an organ of memory, a chamber that retains the echo of its previous tenants. To him, the womb was not passive. It stored, it whispered, it disobeyed. If he was to purge identity entirely, he would have to begin not with the child, but with the mother. Or at least those who had the potential to become one. The house had long employed women from the surrounding villages, widows, wayward daughters, those discarded by their families and taken in for room and coin. Alderney chose them deliberately. They were nameless to the outside world, already erased by shame or poverty. He referred to them in his notes only as vessels. To cleanse identity, he wrote, we must first interrupt the echo. He claimed it was scientific, though the procedures bore the marks of old ritual. Each woman was brought to the cellar rooms alone, made to lie on a padded table soaked with lime water and fitted with what Alderney called a vaginal retort, a metal funnel connected to a series of tubes and valves designed by Lethbridge himself. The first stage was irrigation. Vinegar, boiled brine, or melted wax was injected into the uterus in precise volumes. Alderney recorded the consistency of screams, the angle of spasm, the duration of hemorrhage. Several women died during the first attempts, their bodies folding inward in violent convulsions. One woman, believed to be no older than 19, bit clean through her tongue before going into shock. Lethbridge dissected her body the same night, noting the uterus had solidified partially, with the wax forming a white cast that held her organs in a twisted position. Alderney wrote, "The memory is sealed. Her body was burned behind the orchard under cover of fog. No record of her name was kept. Other women survived the initial procedures, but withered slowly. Some became mute from trauma. Others drifted in and out of lucidity, cradling invisible children or speaking to walls. Alderney considered these states instructive. He believed memory was leaking through their wombs, manifesting in hallucination. To test this, he introduced conception, not from union but from mixture. Semen was collected from anonymous donors under false pretenses mixed with tinctures of mercury and crushed opium, and inserted post-irrigation to see if implantation would succeed. The results were catastrophic. Several of the women became pregnant. The fetuses, Alderney noted, reflected the contamination. One was born with no discernible facial features, its skin stretched taut across the mouth and nose. Another was born inverted, organs developed outside the rib cage pulsing under a thin membrane. The worst was described only as number 6, a stillborn with translucent skin, underdeveloped limbs, and eyes that never formed sockets. Each of these children was preserved. Their bodies were floated in glass jars of oil and alcohol, lined on a shelf that ran the length of the main hallway. Visitors were told the jars were medical oddities, collected by Lethbridge for anatomical study. In truth, they were Alderney's trophies. proof that memory could be corrupted at the source. The surviving women were never seen by the village again. Some were confined to the upper floors, kept behind bolted doors. Others were used for repeated trials. One woman, labeled in the ledger as Vessel E, underwent 6 successive pregnancies over 4 years. Each ended in stillbirth, each more malformed than the last. Her final birth tore her uterus entirely. She bled to death on the nursery floor while Alderney dictated the event aloud. He never wrote her name, only her measurements, the width of the hips, the angle of dilation, the color of the child's fluid. Lethbridge sewed her body back together and suspended it in the barn rafters to test decomposition in cold air. Her bones were later powdered for fertilizer. What disturbed even some of the household staff, those few who remained long enough to notice, was the absence of emotion from the women themselves. They did not scream after the procedures. They did not weep when their children were jarred and labeled. It was as if something had already been hollowed out of them before Alderney ever touched them. This, he believed, was evidence of success. The memory had been extracted. The womb was now a chamber without echo. He referred to them as successful silences. The children, too, were affected. They were forced to walk the hallways each morning past the row of jars. Each fetus was labeled with a number, no names, no words. Only one jar had a mark etched into its base, a line carved by one of the children in secret. The child who made it was discovered, beaten, and never seen again. But the mark remained, a crooked scratch below specimen 4. It was the only evidence that someone had recognized the thing in the jar as more than a study, as a sibling. Alderney's philosophy reached its apex during these years. In his writings, he declared, "The womb remembers, but we can make it forget, and from that forgetting, create perfection." He began preparing blueprints for a separate facility, a full birthing house dedicated to the procedure. It was never built. His funds were running thin. Lethbridge began to show signs of instability, tremors in the hands, hallucinations, an episode where he claimed to hear the jars breathing at night. Alderney dismissed it as weakness. "He is infected," he wrote. "Perhaps memory lingers in the air." By the end of 1794, the womb experiments began to taper. Too many women had died. The help was harder to replace. The house smelled constantly of vinegar and burnt wax. The children grew quieter still, not out of fear, but of fatigue. What remained was the hallway of jars, silent and suspended, casting long shadows as the sun passed overhead. Visitors stopped asking what they were. Servants stopped dusting them. The house had grown used to its own rot, and through it all, Alderney kept writing. Each fetus, each scar, each vessel reduced to measurements and ink. The womb, he had declared, was conquered. But what he failed to see, or refused to admit, was that the house itself had begun to remember, not with names, not with screams, but with silence too deep to be mistaken for peace. By the turn of 1795, silence had consumed nearly everything inside Alderney's estate. Words, names, faces, futures, all erased under the weight of his doctrine. But silence, he began to feel, could no longer suffice. He wanted proof of what the silence had birthed. Not just obedience, but harmony. Not just mutilation, but music. He believed the children's suffering had formed new patterns, resonant ones, and that their bodies, altered by trauma, now contained tones no ordinary instrument could produce. He wrote of the communion of flesh and air, and called for a new phase in his work, the translation of obedience into sound. The project began in the dissection room. Lethbridge, who now moved slowly and spoke less, was instructed to begin selecting remains. Not all corpses were eligible, only those whose ribs had not cracked during suspension. Alderney believed the undamaged ribcage held superior tone like an untouched violin. Lethbridge boiled the bodies until flesh slid from bone, then separated the rib cages with surgical care. The bones were dried, lacquered, and fitted with catgut strings harvested from livestock intestines. The strings were stretched across the arch of the ribs, secured with copper nails and tuned by ear. Alderney struck each one with a gloved finger, listening for pitch. Some rang sharp, others gave off low, tremulous notes like sobs caught in wood. They called the instruments breath harps. Some were played with bows made of bristle and sinew. Others were plucked by hand, the sound harsh and unsettling like a scream slowed to a lullaby. They were not beautiful. They were not meant to be. They were reminders. Each instrument was named not for the child, but for the number of hours they had survived in earlier trials. 16 minutes, 51 inverted silence. Alderney insisted the children sit before the assembled harps every evening as Lethbridge played. He had converted the nursery into a performance hall, removing cots and installing candlelit alcoves. A raised platform held the choir of bones, each mounted in place like a saintly relic. The music itself was unbearable. The tones were too raw, too close to something recognizably human. Some children began shaking uncontrollably during the sessions. One vomited and was beaten for disrupting the hymn. Alderney claimed their reactions proved success, that their bodies remembered the voices of the dead. Obedience, he wrote, is not the suppression of memory but its absorption. He believed the living must carry the resonance of the fallen. Every breath was to be an echo, every silence a requiem. He forced the children to kneel during the performances. For the youngest, cushions were removed to prolong their pain. Knees bled openly onto the floor, soaking into grooves between the stones. Lethbridge, always meticulous, played with eyes half closed, moving from one rib harp to the next. Sometimes he plucked two simultaneously. Sometimes he dragged the bow across them in slow, shrieking sweeps that filled the halls with a sound not quite music, not quite scream. One child, a boy who had survived 3 chamber trials and 1 near suspension, was made to play a harp built from his sister's bones. He did not know it at first, but during tuning, Alderney leaned down and whispered it into his ear. The boy played without breaking eye contact. His hands trembled, but he did not stop. When it was over, he refused to speak, eat, or move. Days later, he bit through his wrist artery with his own teeth and bled to death before dawn. Alderney noted this as a spontaneous act of harmony, and later preserved the boy's vocal cords in alcohol. Soon, new rituals formed. Children who cried during the music were marked with soot across their mouths and locked in the echo chamber. A sealed stone room designed to reflect even the faintest whimper 100 times over. Most returned mute. Some never came back. A few collapsed from auditory disorientation, unable to separate their own breathing from the screams that filled the air. The walls themselves grew slick with condensation from the breath of the punished. Lethbridge began referring to the space as the lung of the house. Alderney composed his own pieces. He called them sermons for the bone choir. Each one was performed on the eve of a new month, with all children present. The hymns had no lyrics, only tones arranged in patterns he believed mimicked the rhythm of early fetal heartbeat. "This," he said, "is the music before memory." Sometimes he conducted with a baton carved from a femur. Other times he simply stood still, eyes closed, letting the notes guide him. The children were made to hum in unison beneath the sound. Not words, just tones. Those who failed to match pitch were removed and corrected. Correction meant exposure to the string room, where unfinished harps were being tuned. The unfinished ones sounded worse. Some gave off only metallic clatter. Others shrieked when bowed. One harp, assembled from a child who had died of sepsis, gave off a stench so strong the room had to be doused in ash water. Yet it produced a sound so deep, so mournful, Alderney named it God's Rib. He played it himself during each performance, saying it marked the entrance into purity. The sound began to leak beyond the estate. Villagers passing at dusk claimed they heard moaning on the wind, a hollow melody carried across the hills. One woman collapsed in her field upon hearing the echo. It reminded her of the day her son had disappeared. No one spoke of it aloud. The fear had become generational. The music entered dreams. And still the jars in the hallway remained, each fetus floating in silence while the house bled sound. Children grew brittle, bones bowed under years of malnutrition and cold, but they kept kneeling. They kept humming. The music had become a law. The estate was no longer a house, it was an orchestra of obedience, of suffering, of silence made audible. And the choir sang on, not because it wanted to, but because the bones no longer knew how not to. The famine struck the parish slowly at first, then all at once. By 1796, the rains had failed 3 seasons in a row. The fields were brittle, the wheat pale and crumbling in the hand. Potatoes rotted beneath the surface before they could be dug. Livestock miscarried or wandered starving through the lanes, too thin to slaughter, too cursed to save. Mothers began boiling weeds. Fathers pawned tools and prayed through clenched teeth. The village bell no longer rang for weddings, only for burials. First the old, then the infants, then the weak who simply stopped rising from bed. And in the shadow of that hunger, mercy withered. It was in these years that Lord Alderney's estate reopened its gates. Word spread quietly, with the softness of infection. He was offering apprenticeships again, room, board, and coin in exchange for the labor of 1 child per household. Some families resisted, gritting through their misery. But others came to the gates willingly. They did not ask what work the children would do. They did not ask what had become of those who'd entered before. They told themselves anything was better than starving. The line between sacrifice and surrender had become too thin to see. The arrivals were no longer covert. Children were brought in wagons, bundled in borrowed coats, their hair combed for the last time. They looked back only once from behind the iron gates at mothers who turned away before the doors shut. Alderney met none of them. He had no need. Their identities had already been erased in his ledgers, reduced to initials and ink blots. He called them parish contributions. They were welcomed not with comfort but with trial. This new generation of experiments bore a different character. Not secrecy, but spectacle. Alderney and Lethbridge began staging deaths as demonstrations. documenting decomposition as though harvesting from fields. We must understand the yield of the body, Alderney wrote. We must know how long obedience persists after breath ceases. The honey barrels were the first. 7 of them carved from seasoned oak, filled with thick amber syrup shipped from overseas at staggering cost. Children, often the smallest, the quietest, were chosen for these trials. They were suffocated first, usually by pressing linen soaked in laudanum against their mouths. Then their bodies were lowered into the viscous fluid, limbs folded tightly, mouths stitched shut with silver thread. One child, still faintly breathing when immersed, clawed at the inside of the barrel until his fingers bled. His body lasted 78 days before decay began. Alderney celebrated the discovery. Honey halts the collapse, obedience suspended in sweetness. Another method involved burial beneath layers of quicklime. The chosen child was placed in a shallow pit lined with ash. A wet cloth was laid over their face, and then the lime poured, slowly, deliberately, its chemical heat burning through flesh even as breath continued. The goal was not death, but data. How long could a human survive under calcifying pressure? Could the final moments be timed, measured, preserved? Lethbridge marked the minutes between movement and stillness with scratches on a wooden beam. The beam still bore those marks when the house was eventually abandoned. Witnesses to these deaths were not spared. Other children were forced to observe, standing in silence at the pit's edge or watching the barrels sealed. It was not punishment. It was pedagogy. The message was clear. Even in death, your body belongs to us. Even in rot, you will serve a purpose. Some children broke entirely. One girl plucked her own eyelashes out, one by one, every night for weeks. Another began walking backward through the halls, refusing to face forward again. Alderney noted her behavior as reflexive resistance to linearity. Fascinating. She died days later, having drunk ink from one of the study wells. Lethbridge, once methodical, now appeared consumed. He stopped bathing, spoke to the jars as if they responded, began injecting small animals with embalming fluid just to watch their reactions. He took to keeping organs in his coat pockets, fondling them during meals like worry stones. When a boy collapsed in the corridor, convulsing from internal bleeding, Lethbridge insisted on opening him up in the hallway itself. Blood pooled across the stone as the other children walked past. No one looked away. Alderney's writings became increasingly grandiose. He began to view himself as a farmer of souls, recording each death not as an ending, but as a harvest. He kept a thick volume titled Yield Ledger, in which he recorded cause, method, time to failure, and psychological bloom. His term for the moment when resistance transformed into surrender. The entries read like seasonal notes. Beneath honey, 78 days. Skin preserved, eyes collapsed, bloom at day 60. Or lime burial, 38 minutes of breath. Bloom began at minute 21. The estate by now had shifted. It no longer resembled a house. The nursery smelled of rotting sugar. The hallways were stained with lime dust. The windows were always shuttered, but inside everything was exposed. The children no longer flinched. They cleaned the barrels, they swept the ashes, they watched their peers chosen and said nothing. Even mercy had turned its face away. Still, parents kept coming. Hunger is louder than rumor. Some returned after months, hoping for a letter, a visit, a glimpse. They were turned away without word. One woman, frantic, climbed the wall at night and was caught inside the orchard. Her body was found 3 days later, half buried beneath the roots of a tree. Her eyes had been removed. No report was filed. This was the collapse, not of morality but of the very instinct to mourn. The village had adjusted. The price of bread was still rising. The parish ledger was still blank. And Alderney's house continued its work, now with no pretense of salvation. No one was saved, no one was fed. There was only the yield. And each night, as the candles burned low, Lethbridge would walk the halls humming the same tune played on the bone harps. It echoed now, not just in the music room, but in the very structure of the estate. A resonance of ruin, a harmony of death, measured and measured again. They came in the spring of 1797, not with torches or banners, but with ink and questions. 3 men sent quietly by a distant relative of the crown who had heard too many whispers from too many places. A bishop, a magistrate, and a physician from London. Officially, they came on behalf of charity oversight to inspect the welfare of apprentices. Unofficially, they were sent to silence rumor or confirm it. They arrived in a black carriage, coat sleeves crisp, boots polished. The village watched from behind shutters as they entered Alderney's estate, guided by a footman who did not speak. Behind the gate, the house swallowed them. For 3 days, no one left. No carriage returned, no letters were sent. The children were kept indoors. The servants moved like paper dolls, smiling without urgency. And when the 4th morning came, the estate returned to its routines as if the men had never arrived. In town, no one asked. Their names were not recorded in any official parish account. But Alderney did record them, not in his usual ledger of numbers, but in a private journal, now brittle with mildew, where he wrote with careful triumph, "They came to judge me, but I made them part of the house." Years later, long after the estate had been abandoned and the door hinges rusted to silence, fragments of what had happened were found behind the walls. The journal described it plainly. The bishop was taken first, not for punishment, but for ritual. Alderney had grown fascinated by the notion of sanctified flesh. He believed that holy men contained different frequencies in their bones and that religious silence could be transferred through skin. The bishop was bled slowly over 3 days, his body suspended upside down in the old prayer chamber. Alderney noted that his vocal cords twitched for nearly an hour after death. His skin was flayed in precise strips, soaked in vinegar and layered between the nursery walls to dampen sound. Alderney called this blessed insulation. The magistrate lasted longer. He was found to be curious, even skeptical, but polite. Alderney dined with him, walked the grounds, showed him only what was designed to be seen. But something in the magistrate's posture gave him away. Perhaps it was the glance held too long on the hallway of jars, or the way his fingers tightened when a child passed by. Alderney took no chances. He invited the man to observe one of Lethbridge's sound decay trials, a procedure where a dying body was fitted with a thin brass bell beside the windpipe, meant to ring faintly with each final breath. Once the magistrate leaned in close enough, Lethbridge struck his temple with a mallet, killing him instantly. The bell still rang, Alderney noted, even after death. The magistrate's hands were removed, boiled, and mounted in the study as coat hooks. His torso was never found intact. The physician from London was different. He had studied under more cautious minds, had read of Hunter but rejected his methods. He came with skepticism but also with sorrow. He spoke in private of the stories he'd heard, of children who had vanished, of letters intercepted, of relatives who never returned. Alderney seemed to like him. For 2 days he let the man speak freely. On the 3rd day he gave him a choice, to leave untouched if he could complete a final experiment. The experiment was simple. The physician would be sealed in a room with the preserved remains of 5 children, each suspended in jars, and he would be given 1 hour to determine, without cutting, which had died first. Alderney called it the memory test. It was impossible, of course. There were no timestamps. The jars were deliberately clouded, the bodies deliberately distorted. When the hour passed, Alderney entered to find the man curled in the corner, weeping silently. That, Alderney wrote, was proof he had failed. "Grief," he said aloud, "is a contamination." The physician was not killed immediately. He was kept alive for another week, force-fed a tincture made from ground fetal bone and lavender oil, intended to sterilize sentiment. When he stopped resisting, Alderney believed the man was cured. Then he flayed his face, carefully removing the skin in one intact piece and hanging it above the nursery door. The rest of the body was placed behind the walls, layered with lime, sealed in timber. That was the purpose of their visit, Alderney believed, not oversight, but offering. They had come to bear witness, and in doing so they had become part of the structure. Their deaths were not warnings, they were integrations. Each man's remains served a purpose: insulation, mounting, filtration. The estate grew warmer after their deaths, quieter. Rooms lost their echo. The children too changed. Some stopped blinking. Some developed nervous tics that aligned with the rhythm of dripping water. Others began speaking in perfect unison when startled, their voices merging into a single flat tone. Outside the estate, a courier was turned away at the gate a week later. He claimed to be following up on the visit. He was told the men had already left, that their carriage had passed before dawn. The courier returned to London with nothing. No report was filed. No inquiry followed. Alderney's influence reached further than most knew. Through unpaid debts, buried favors, and whispered promises made in halls of power. Those who might have questioned him found their careers stalled, their reputations stained, their funding mysteriously withdrawn. Silence had become more than a method. It was a shield. Lethbridge, now fully unbound from reason, kept the bishop's skull near his bedside, claiming he could hear psalms in the creaking of the bone. He had stopped eating entirely, sustained only by herbal infusions and marrow broth. He grew translucent. His hands trembled as he played the rib harps, though the children still knelt and listened. The visitors had vanished, but their presence was eternal. For Alderney, the integration of outsiders proved his theory that memory, like flesh, could be stripped, repurposed, and made useful. That judgment could be layered into the walls and forgotten. That mercy, the final obstacle, could collapse entirely under the weight of design. And the house remained untouched, protected not by force but by favor, by silence, by the knowledge that no one outside would risk becoming a part of it. By the spring of 1801, the gates of the Alderney estate had not opened in months. No smoke rose from its chimneys, no servants were seen fetching supplies in the village. The silence that had once signaled obedience now suggested abandonment. Rumors churned. Some said Alderney had fled to Vienna under another name, escorted by those who still owed him debts. Others whispered of a deeper fate, that he had knelt with his children beneath the cellar floor and ordered his own burial, that he had sealed himself in with the bones and jars and echoes he had made, that he had become part of the house entirely. The truth, when it surfaced, was worse. The villagers had waited too long. When they finally breached the estate gates, led not by law but by dread and necessity, the house met them not with resistance, but with rot. The wood was damp with years of breath and fluid. The walls sweated salt. It covered everything. Thick layers smeared across thresholds, piled in corners, clotted beneath stairwells. Buckets of it lined the hallways. The walls had been painted with it, handprints still visible where children had dragged their palms, forced to cleanse surfaces with raw flesh. Salt had been Alderney's last ritual, not to preserve the house, but to bind it, to poison the land, to keep whatever had grown there from ever taking root again. The rooms were untouched by time, but warped by purpose. In the nursery, the bone harp stood silent. A layer of dust coated the strings, but the instruments remained perfectly arranged, lit by sunlight that passed through slitted shutters like razors. The cots were gone. In their ideal place, small stone basins had been built into the floor, each lined with copper nails and filled with water, now stagnant and slick. Lethbridge's journals found on a desk in the adjacent room detailed his final weeks, a series of failed experiments involving submergence fasting and breath restriction under salt vapor. He wrote of seeing faces in the water. The ink had bled in places, but his last entry remained clear. The house listens. It does not forgive. Beneath the floorboards in the narrow root cellar, they found the ledgers. Dozens of them, leather-bound, meticulously stacked, organized by year, and every page blank. No names, no dates, no signatures. Just thousands of sheets, clean and pale as bone. A silence so absolute it had become recorded. Alderney had built a system so obsessed with the erasure of memory that even his records remembered nothing. The villagers turned the pages with shaking hands, some growing nauseous, others weeping without knowing why. It was not the absence that disturbed them. It was the precision of it, as if the blankness had been placed there deliberately, one page at a time, like a prayer. The children were gone. No bodies were found in beds or corners, no piles of cloth or bones, but they were there, in the walls. The mortar had been mixed with bone dust, hair, skin strips still clinging to plaster. Behind the library shelves, one panel gave way to a cavity filled with stacked limbs arranged by size. In the chapel, they found the bishop's robe sewn into the altar cloth, stained with salt and oil. A row of skulls sat beneath the floorboards, each marked not with names but carved symbols, circles, slashes, stars, Alderney's silent taxonomy. And in the orchard, beneath the bloomless trees, the ground refused to give. Digging uncovered nothing but salt-hardened clay. No worms, no roots, no memory. One man claimed the soil hissed when broken. Another said he saw blood seep upward for a moment before the earth swallowed it again. Whether they were hallucinations or not, no one returned to dig further. Alderney's body was never found, but in the center of the cellar a circle had been carved into the stone. A ritual basin rimmed with wax, filled with a congealed mixture of ink, bone ash, and something that smelled faintly of vinegar. In it lay a single item, a page torn from a ledger. Still blank. The villagers fled the house that night. They sealed the doors with iron nails, dragged stone over the thresholds, salted the perimeter until white crusts clung to every blade of grass. No priest would come. No bishop remained. So they did what they could. They covered the orchard in lime and let it die. They burned what they could carry from the house. They never spoke the name Alderney aloud again. Not in church, not in taverns, not to their children. The estate was left to rot. No animals grazed near it. Birds avoided the rooftops. Trees leaned away from the walls. Over the years, the land began to crack, as if pushing the house upward and out. But the foundation held. Beneath it, silence persisted. The salt kept the memory still. Children born after the fall were told only this: that house is dead. You must let it stay that way. But some still wandered close. Some claimed they heard humming through the cellar vents when the wind blew just right. A low, bone-strung sound like a breath caught in a jar. Alderney was never charged, never tried. His name disappeared from court rolls. No portrait remains. Some say his ashes were mixed into the final mortar. Others believe he walked away unseen and built another house somewhere further out, under another name, another parish, another system of silence. But this place, the salted ruins, became the warning. Fields around it were abandoned. A new road was built to bypass it entirely. Even maps of the region began to omit the land. The erasure was total, deliberate, not as justice, but as fear.